Hello, I'm Sally Noll with the University of Minnesota Extension Service, and I'm a poultry extension specialist and working in the area of management nutrition, particularly in turkeys. And for my presentation today, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to the anatomy and physiology of the poultry respiratory system. This should give you some pretty good background for the subsequent presentations that are going to be provided in the coming weeks. I did include my email at the bottom of the slide there. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me since I work in a variety of locations. Okay, so for a little bit of introduction and background, just a couple of my thoughts anyways about why you should know about the respiratory system of poultry and why you would want to keep it healthy. So a couple of the reasons anyways would be from a performance standpoint, is particularly if you're raising birds for meat or egg production. The respiratory system is key in terms of providing the oxygen for many of the metabolic reactions that need to go on. Likewise, in terms of a health issue as well, processing, if we keep a healthy respiratory tract, that should have a positive impact on the carcass quality, whereas getting some infections that cause inflammation of different parts of the respiratory tract can also cause condemnation of the carcass because of not fit for human consumption. As I mentioned already, there's the health aspect, but there's also the well-being aspect that we want to keep our animals healthy and give them the best environment possible. And then from the standpoint of at least some respiratory diseases anyways, these are some of these may be reportable to official organizations because of the nature of the disease. So they could be reportable at an international level, a federal level, or a state level, such as to the Minnesota Board of Animal Health. And in these cases, they can also have an impact on continuity of business operation if restrictions are placed on the operation or exports are limited. My outline of the presentation then is just going to be to cover some aspects of the function of the respiratory system, and then look a little bit closer at the anatomy and its relationship to functionality. Just a little bit on what a normal respiratory system looks like versus some potential clinical signs. And again, a really brief to let you know that there can be non-infectious causes that would cause inflammation in the respiratory tract as compared to what we typically think of disease impacts. And then just a brief reminder on the upcoming presentations. So the functions of the respiratory system, most obvious, of course, is the exchange of gases in the lungs. And so looking to inhale or input oxygen into the system through absorption in the lungs, and then that's going to take and replace the carbon dioxide, which is going to be exhaled. Unique to the birds a little bit is that they have approximately a 2-time greater exchange efficiency because of the way their respiratory system is set up in terms of constant flow of air over into the lungs where the absorption occurs. A couple of the other things that we may forget about from the standpoint of the respiratory system is it also plays a role in thermal regulation, regulating the body temperature of the bird, particularly heat loss aspects. So in the summertime, when birds are under heat stress or getting a little bit warm, they may take and pant, and that results in evaporative cooling through that action, and birds are able to lose some heat that way. Another part of the respiratory system is the vocalization aspect, which we'll touch upon briefly. And then it also plays a role in acid-base balance or pH shift in the blood, and obviously to maintain good operating criteria, characteristics, we don't want too much of a shift in the blood. Okay, some other unique aspects relative for avians versus mammals anyways is that lungs don't change volume, whereas in mammals the lungs are flexible and they increase in volume when inhaling and decrease in volume when exhaling. In birds anyways, the lungs are rigid and so they don't change their shape. Also, a portion of the lungs anyways are embedded in the ribs or the rib cage. Now, inspiration or inhalation and expiration or exhalation is actually an active muscle activity for both movements. And so this is really critical to recognize that birds need to use their sternal muscles as well as their rib cage muscles to take an inhale and exhale. And so a particular thing to note here is that when you're restraining birds, you need to make sure that you're not restraining them too aggressively so that they're no longer able to breathe. Another part of the inspiration expiration cycles is that the air sacs, and we'll talk about those a little bit more too, they act as a bellows to move the air through. Because the lungs are not changing volume, then we need to figure out a different way to have air move through the system. And actually, if you think of a molecule of oxygen, if you want to, with the initial inspiration, it actually takes 2 cycles of inspiration and expiration for that molecule to make its way through the entire respiratory system. And airflow is mostly unidirectional through the bronchi and through the air sacs. We can take and split the respiratory system into 3 major sections. The upper airways, which consist of the nasal cavity and the nares, which are the openings to the nasal cavity, the turbinates and the sinuses, larynx, trachea, and syrinx, and we'll point those out on a diagram here shortly. Then we also have, once the trachea will take and divide, and it divides into 2 primary bronchus and then continues to, and that each of those bronchi continue to divide into smaller tubules, if you want to call it that pass through the lungs, so secondary bronchi and parabronchi. Then we also have the air sacs, and they can either be paired or singular within the bird's body cavity. Okay, so actually the nares are the only things that we can actually see from a respiratory system, externally anyways, in the birds. And so here we have a picture, nice tom turkey, and where the arrow is pointing is to the opening of the nasal cavity in this area here. So just to get you familiar with the location. And finally, a diagram here that can kind of help you locate where different things are relative to the respiratory system. So initially, air is taken in through the nares and enters the nasal cavity. It's set up such that there's some components called terminates, which can kind of help to take and filter particles out, adds heat to the air, and can also take and humidify the air at the same time. Then we have the larynx. Can't really see it on this diagram in detail, but it's in this location here. And so that's the opening to the trachea. And with mechanisms that are available, it can either let air through, or it can also prevent food and water or other contaminants from taking and entering the trachea. Obviously, we don't want to be inhaling very many things into the lungs other than what needs to be there. The trachea itself is a long tube that then extends and comes to a point down here. The trachea, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but it's a somewhat rigid structure, as you would think it needs to be, so it doesn't collapse. When it reaches to the point where it splits off to the primary bronchi, that is also the location where the syrinx is, and the syrinx is involved in vocalization primarily. Then we have the lungs that are sitting in this area here, and as I mentioned, they're involved in the gaseous exchange. And then just a reminder that the air sacs are also present, but they're not shown on this particular diagram. Trachea, just a couple comments. The lining of the trachea has cilia, and these are finger-like projections that take and move back and forth. And one of their functions is to take and move particles towards the mouth. These could be dust, mucus, or bacteria. So they do play in a role in terms of trying to prevent infection or minimize impacts of of some higher dust loads or something like that. However, under really severe conditions or infection, that cilia function can be lost or the cilia themselves can be destroyed. So under conditions of poor air quality, infection, or excess mucus production. So here we have some very good, nice, normal cilia. And then down here we can see where the cilia are starting to get matted with mucus and therefore starting to lose their ability to take and move those particles. As I mentioned, there's also cartilage rings, which can sometimes be affected by certain diseases. And in that case, those rings are there to take and maintain shape and maintain good airflow through the trachea. Another little area that can cause some problems is where we have the trachea here, splitting into the primary bronchus on each side of the bird, and the syrinx is in this area. It's a membranous, has different membranes and muscles to take and make sound. Because of the narrowing here, if there is infection or inflammation going on, you can get some blockage again of the air in these areas. So I mentioned air sacs several times, and they are basically spaces within the body cavity of the bird. And so in this particular picture here, we have, we're showing at least a portion of the air sac membrane here. They're very thin-walled membranes on a healthy respiratory system. These membranes will be clear and thin, but they're not very well vascularized, and so that makes them susceptible to infection and can also take and limit treatment. If we look down here, there's the condition called air saculitis, which is inflammation, and we see cloudiness, discoloration, different things that are basically growing on that air sac wall. Over time, that air sac, the membrane will also continue to take and thicken. And so this is what we don't like to see. Okay, so just to give me an idea where the air sacs are, we have the abdominal, caudal, and we have a cranial, and then clavicular. And these are all paired air sacs. And then we also have a singular cervical air sac that follows along very closely with the trachea. So just to give you an idea where those are located. And not to spend a lot of time here, but this kind of shows you the airflow. So on inhalation, air enters. Some of it goes into the posterior air sacs, or those air sacs that are towards the vent abdominal cavity. But air is also going through the lung, and then on another inspiration will also enter into the anterior air sacs. On exhalation, again, a couple of cycles, that air will take and move out of the air sacs. Again, continues at the same time. There's always air passing through the lungs and then eventually be exhaled. So that's where some of that efficiency comes in terms of O2 exchange, or O2 and CO2 exchange. If we're talking about respiratory clinical signs, there's probably three areas that you'd want to look at. Externally, what you can see happening with the bird behavior, what might be going on there, and also what kinds of sounds or sounds that the birds are not making. And so just a couple of examples here. We have, for external signs, the nares. Remember we talked about those being the openings to the nasal cavity. Again, if there's crusting, mucus, drainage in that, you can see where that starts to crust up over time, and it also can crust around the beak and other parts of the head there. Birds do have an infraorbital sinus, and that can become infected and have swelling occur there. And then sometimes with the eyes anyways, we can also see drainage from the eyes, can sometimes appear foamy. And in the case of the turkey poult here, because of the swelling and so forth that's going on, it can actually take and appear to change the shape of the eye to more of an almond-shaped eye instead of a nice circular eye. So these are some of the things that you can look out for. Then from a behavior standpoint, we can have head shaking. In turkeys anyways, at least on our farm birds anyways, sometimes we can see something that's called some wiping, or I'm calling it wiping activity, where the birds actually kind of take and wipe their face and eyes on their shoulder. And in that case, then you can get some brown staining or dirty shoulder feathers. Of course, you could only really see this in white-feathered poultry. Open mouth breathing, again, because of probably blockages in the trachea and other parts of the respiratory system, and then also gasping where there could be blockages as well. For sounds, I think probably pretty obvious there. But remember, a change in vocalization. So if they call, or the tone or the frequency or the pattern has changed, that could be representative of potential change in the respiratory system. And then other things like coughing, sneezing, gurgling sounds, and that can also tell you that there's some mucus production going on. Causes of respiratory symptoms then, they can be either non-infectious or infectious. Under non-infectious, a couple of examples would be poor air quality. And so when we talk about air quality, we can talk about ammonia, gaseous ammonia. We can talk about dust that's in the air. That dust can contain fecal material, it can contain molds, it can contain other microorganisms too. And so that's why we like to try to see some kind of dust control where possible. Ammonia can take in, and both of these can be irritants as well, and take in and be irritating to the tissues in the respiratory system and even provide some destruction, such as the cilia that we talked about in previous slides in the trachea. Sometimes we can run into some nutritional causes. One nutrient in particular, vitamin A. Vitamin A is very critical for membrane integrity, and so under deficient conditions, it makes the bird more susceptible then to respiratory issues. And then under infectious, there's a variety of different things that can cause or can settle in the respiratory system of the bird and cause disease conditions. And so for the upcoming presentations anyways, the concentration is going to be on a few key viruses. So this is a reminder of the upcoming presentations. They're on Tuesdays through February 9th, and all the workshops the workshops will be broadcast via Zoom. So next week, the presentation will be on avian influenza and Newcastle disease, and then following week would be infectious laryngotracheitis, infectious bronchitis virus, and mycoplasma. And then the last two are kind of after you know a little bit more about these diseases, what do you do then? So some diagnosis and how to work with the veterinary diagnostic lab. And then, of course, the best thing to do would be to have a good biosecurity program to keep diseases from entering into your flock. And this is true whether you're talking, 6 birds or 30,000 birds. And so registration information is shown below here, and then please contact Wayne Martin if you have any additional questions about the workshops and that. And so at this point in time, I think we're going to have a question and answer session. And again, I express my appreciation to the organizers of the workshop, Wayne Martin, Abby Schuft, and Colleen, and for inviting me to give the presentation. So thank you.